Welcome to EPG Pathshala, and I'm Swati Banerjee, Associate Professor at the School of Social Work, Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. And today I'll be talking to you on sexual division of labor, which is part of the paper on gender and social work. Sexual division of labor is an interesting understanding which tries to look at what men do and what women do and why do they do what they do. So the topics that we'll discuss today would include this understanding of sexual division of labor, the key constructs that influences this understanding, and some of the key theoretical frameworks like economic and sociological functionalism, liberalism, Marxist feminist analysis, radical feminist analysis, the dual systems theory, the social and sectoral division of labor, the domestic division of labor, and we'll look at how some of this evolved to kind of explain the understanding of sexual division of labor and references for you to look at it in future. Understanding sexual division of labor. What does this mean? You see this picture, and this is something we see very often at different sites, maybe when we are walking on the road, at the construction sites. It says caution, men at work. Does this mean that woman doesn't work? Does woman not work at the construction sites? Does woman not work in other spaces? But we'll never see a signboard saying woman at work. Well, now let's examine some of the questions to explore this a little further. Why do women earn typically less than their male counterparts? Why do women engage in less paid jobs? Why do women do different jobs than men? Or why are women forced to do sometimes different jobs than men? The answer to some of these questions lies in the fundamental concept of the sexual division of labor between women and men in both the public domain as well as the private sphere of the household. The sexual division of labor also leads to different job segregation by sex, and we'll try to understand some of this as we move into our discussion. This is another photograph, a very common occurrence everywhere in the world. It's about who does what within the household. How does power hierarchies plays out within family, within domestic relations. And some of these ideas are also part of our textbooks which our children read. For example, in one of the primary school textbooks, in a very different subjects, for example in maths, the example was about the father goes to office and the mother cooks at home. Now my son comes up with this understanding and tells me, my mother, it's written my mother cooks at home, but my mother also goes to office. Why is this dichotomy? Why it is not written in the text? So how do we understand this kind of constructions which also stereotypes children from childhood? The key constructs in understanding sexual division of labor. The division of labor between women and men is considered to be the most natural aspect of human society, something that is seemingly based on biological division of labor in procreation. It is in fact the social construction of the biological fact of women's childbearing and nursing capacity that forms the actual basis of sexual division of labor in the larger society and economy. Also, the sexual division of labor, as Miss says, cannot be attributed to some universal sexism of men as such, but it is a consequence of capitalist mode of production which is only interested in those parts of the human body which can be directly used as the instruments of labor or which can become an extension of the machine. So here the conversation moves from not only what men do and women do, but also a larger capitalist society in which labor is perceived in a particular manner, and how technology simultaneously influences that labor and creates sexual division of labor. Some of the theoretical frameworks which influences our understanding of sexual division of labor would be, for example, the economic and sociological functionalism. Functionalists argue that women get paid less than men because they have less skill and labor market experience and fewer qualifications than men, and as a consequence of the differential time allocation by men and women in the households. Now, this is a functionalist idea that men have skills, so they get better jobs. Women don't have skills, they get not so better jobs. But here it's very important to contest this functionalist idea and ask why. Why do women have to drop out from schools? Why do women have lesser skills? Why do women not get better paid jobs? So the very fact that they're denied certain kind of education, the very fact that they're denied certain kind of skills training itself talks about a patriarchal structure leading to sexual division of labor. Also, the human capital theorists, for example, assume that people get paid according to their value or worth as understood by the employer. They are of the option that women have less human capital than men, and because of their position in the family. Now, this theory argues that since women play, again, it kind of tries to answer that why. It argues that because women play the chief homemaker role in the household, they spend less time in paid employment and hence acquire less human capital and less pay than men. And it again leads to a lot of stereotypes. I remember long time back when I had gone for one of the interviews for a job, one of the questions to me was, are you married? Now, that's not a question which is usually asked to a man. Why such questions are asked to women? Essentially because the underlying assumption would be, if you are married, then you would be more involved in household responsibilities, and therefore the kind of time that you might allot to your office work would be less, and therefore they might choose a man over a woman. The major theoretical problem of the human capital theory is that it is based on the assumption of a perfect labor market in which employers pay the employees according to their worth. And as we know, in a capitalist neoliberal society, there's nothing like a perfect labor market. A lot of other feminists argue that the main source of wage differentials is the job segregation that is determined by the sex. The other key theoretical construct that explains sexual division of labor is liberalism. Many of these theorists use the notion of cultural differentiation between men and women as the leading cause of disadvantages faced by women at work. For example, they argue that cultural pressures and organizational features results in less success among women than men in reaching the upper echelons of these institutions. Through her study, some of this feminist shows that how management ethics in primarily masculine and workspaces slots job hierarchy and gender specific role in a particular manner, preventing a person from other sex or preventing a woman from gaining access to such a position. Now, this has been explained by studies by looking at the corporate culture, where day-to-day interactions in male-dominated networks that act to exclude women from the knowledge and contact necessary for corporate success. For example, very recently, one woman in the corporate sector, she was talking about how her male colleagues would always have a discussion over dinner, and she would not be able to participate in those discussions, and it also meant that she then was not privy to a lot of these discussions, and it impacted her upward mobility in the organization. Some of these practices, which sometimes we are not even conscious of, can actually lead to a division in terms of men and women's work and could reduce women's privilege in certain kinds of work. So how do we look at this masculine culture or male-dominated networks in workspaces? The critique to this kind of an idea does not confront the basic causes of unequal division of labor in the private and public domain, of why women take the major burden of work at home and why men are a majority in the paid workforce. So they say it's not just enough to say that because women are largely involved in the household spaces, they are not able to participate in public spheres or in paid work. It's important to understand what leads women to not participate or why women should take the maximum burden of household work. The Marxist feminist analysis. The Marxist feminist theorists have analyzed the pattern of women's employment in the labor market as determined by capitalist relations. They argue that women's lower pay and lesser labor force participation are critically shaped by capital-labor relations. Humphreys argues that women's absence from the labor market is the result of a struggling of the working class for a family wage against the opposition of the capital. So one of the important arguments in this analysis is that men should also demand for a family wage, essentially because they have to take care of their family, which includes the woman. Now the critique of this analysis. Many men who earn the so-called family wage do not support their family. We know a lot of men how they spend their money in drinking, etc. Whereas many women who do not even receive a family wage support their children and other dependents in the family. This essentially says the argument for a family wage might again confine women into the household work and the household chores, while males or men are being privileged in the public sphere. The radical feminist analysis. Radical feminists have written very little about women in paid employment, and the focus of their empirical work has been mostly in the understanding of sexuality and violence. They have made important contributions, however, to the understanding of the issues of sexual harassment, especially sexual harassment at the workplace. Stanko, in 1988, addresses the significance of sexual harassment for occupational segregation. The sexual harassment, she says, is used as a tool to maintain occupational closure against women. Sexual harassment at workplace, as we all know, is a daily reality in the lives of many women. It doesn't only happen in offices, in the corporate sector. It also happens at different work sites. For example, if a tribal woman is working at the brick kiln, for a woman from a nomadic tribe, it's a reality that is all-encompassing, and we need to understand this reality to be able to understand and see why this happens to women and how this restricts women's spaces in the workplace, and how this also continuously creates a fear amongst women to be able to participate in the workforce. Dual systems theory. Hartman argues that since patriarchy predates capitalism, patriarchal relations in paid employment cannot simply be understood in terms of capitalism. So largely, the dual systems theory essentially talks about both patriarchy and capitalism and how it influences each other to create the sexual division of labor. But they privilege patriarchy because they say patriarchy has evolved much earlier and it transcends into capitalism. Central to her understanding of gender relations in employment is the job segregation again by sex. She is of the opinion that men are able to exclude women from better paid jobs and create this glass ceiling and keep them at a disadvantage. And men can primarily do this essentially because they are better organized than women in terms of their participation in trade unions, which exclude a large number of women. Now again the question would be, Why are women not part of these unions or trade unions? It would go back to the argument that women are largely confined to their household or household chores, and it's still considered as a primary responsibility, and therefore they would just do what is important in terms of their work and would not spend extra time in participating in unionizing and other activities. When men are in better paid jobs and then they are able to, the argument is they are able to marry women in their favorable terms. For example, we all know how it plays out in India, and if we look at the matrimonials, for example, a man having in the IS would want a certain kind of woman who would be very beautiful, etc., etc. Within the Indian context, it also leads to certain kind of dowry. Well, so they better paid men have women of their choice, and this woman would do all the housework for them and take care of their children. Women who are financially dependent on their husbands, therefore, cannot refuse, and men's access to better employment opportunities also results in them earning the so-called family wage. So it's actually a vicious cycle. Men in better paid jobs, having women who are confined to the households, this woman being dependent on the men, doing the household work for men, and then men blaming capitalism and saying that they need a family wage or better wages. Well, capitalism is definitely something which needs to be looked at and needs to be unpacked, because it causes difficulty to many marginalized groups, but simultaneously the argument here is, please don't ignore patriarchy and the power relations and how that combines to create this sexual division of labor. The social and sectoral division of labor. Social division of labor between women and men refers to the fact that throughout society, women are held responsible for domestic tasks like we have discussed, cooking, cleaning, raising of children, whereas men are usually exempted from this task. And if they do this task, they are helping. For example, if let's say in a nuclear family, husband is doing a lot of things, people would usually say, you have such a wonderful husband, he is idolized. But if the woman is doing all the work, they wouldn't say you are doing wonderful work, because it's your work and you have to do it. Sectoral division of labor, on the other hand, refers to the fact that within specific sectors of a given economy, agricultural or industrial sector, a hierarchical division of labor is maintained and perpetuated between women and men. Whereas the former is universal in nature, that's the social division of labor, and it's fixed, often fixed. The later, that is the sectoral division of labor, changes over a time according to the need to preserve male power and privilege over women. Men's monopoly also over the instruments of technology in production is identified by feminist scholars as a means to enforce male dominance and perpetuate the sexual division of labor. And they say it's actually a new addition to preserve and perpetuate sexual division of labor. Manual work and operations performed with the help of technology lead to sexual division of labor and leads to distinctions in labor types, for example, skilled, semi-skilled and unskilled tasks. And we end up in a situation where women are largely unskilled and end up as unskilled workers, and therefore there is a wage difference. Domestic division of labor. You can see this picture, and a little girl is telling her mother, Mama, how come daddy never cooks or clean? Well, it's a very common feature in many of the households. The domestic or the household division of labor refers to the distribution of responsibilities and tasks between different family members necessary for the maintenance of the household or domestic spaces or home. The traditional domestic division of labor is that in which men have the primary responsibility for working outside in exchange for a wage, and women undertake the responsibility of managing the household work, cleaning, cooking, all of that. And this, as I said, is also reinforced through the textbooks and through other spaces. And also another critique of it would be that, though we are talking about, men as wage earners and women as working within the households, that kind of a division of labor, but also often what is ignored in this kind of a discussion is that not all women have the privilege to stay within the household and do household work. Most marginalized women have to work every day, and that kind of work gets neglected. And within that kind of work, the wages that they get is much lower than that of men. They're largely unskilled, and there's a lot of sexual harassment. There is usually that kind of discussion usually doesn't happen within this mainstream feminist discourse or understanding of sexual division of labor. Now, the other understanding here is also that in contrast to men, the work done by women is, as sexual division of labor theorist argument, is unpaid and hence considered unproductive because it is performed within the confines of the home. It is the domestic division of labor that acts to weaken women's position in the labor market, and similarly, the hierarchical division of labor in the household is perpetuated by the labor market. So it interacts with each other, and ultimately it's woman who suffers. To conclude this discussion about who does what, why they have to do what they do, as we started with, we have tried to look at the way sexual division of labor plays out in different spaces within the household, in the public sphere, and what are the norms and values that guides this division of labor. We have discussed the history and social origins of the sexual division of labor, and we have attempted to understand the concept through different theoretical perspectives. The various schools of thought, like economic and sociological functioning, liberalism, Marxism, and Marxist feminist analysis, and the dual systems theory, have offered us different explanations for the existing sexual division of labor in employment, within the household, and various other spaces. Feminist movements across the globe have been fighting against wage discrimination in different sectors of the economy, hierarchical differences between the sexes, the nature of work allotted to women, the system of payment, working and living conditions of women workers, and the unpaid nature of domestic work. They have been stressing on the importance of fighting patriarchy and global capitalism as being the root causes of the ongoing exploitation of poor women and men in different parts of the world. So the underlying concern is both patriarchy and global capitalism, and the need to deal and address both to be able to remove this hierarchical sexual division of labor that exists in our society and disadvantages not only women but also disadvantages men. I'm sure you would like this concept and would want to go deeper into it and look at some of the references here. For example, the references by Harry, for example, talks about labor and the monopoly in the capital. Then there are books by Irene which talks about women as a reserve army of labor. Michelle talks about the family wage, and Peter talks about the capitalist patriarchy. The other interesting book would be by Hartman, and yes, Sylvia Walby about theorizing patriarchy. So this would also help you deepen the understanding about this construct. And I end with this very simple but very exciting and very important quote which says, "Be the change you want to see in the world." And I hope that we definitely would want to change the world from this very hierarchical sexual division of labor and would work towards a more equal space. So thank you so much.